name is VRWorks. I'm here to talk about virtual reality. Hopefully, many of you had a chance yesterday or earlier today to go try it out back in the tents we have set up over there. So we've been fascinated by virtual reality ever since it's actually for decades, but since this last wave started, we started looking at it immediately, and we quickly identified that it's fundamentally there's similarities with what we do in games, with all the problems that exist in games, but there's a new set of problems that need to be solved to solve this, to do it correctly. Unlike a game where you're essentially looking at a window into a world, with virtual reality, you're actually inside it, and you can't really understand what that means until you've actually tried it and experienced it for a while. We struggle with this all the time whenever we want to demo any of the virtual reality things that we're doing. It's almost impossible to do on stage. You can't just show people a window into this world. You have to actually step into it and experience it. And to really feel the immersion correctly, it's not sufficient to just make things look okay. Often in games we cheat. That's how we get the performance, and it's cheating, but it's good kind of cheating that we do. In virtual reality, many of the cheats that we implement just kind of break down. It doesn't work. When you're inside this world, instead of just looking at it through a window, you get to see all of the things that developers do to make it work correctly in a video game, but they look like they're just painted or faked. And so we need a lot more performance than we currently have to do this correctly. But in addition to the visual senses, we also need to simulate audio for our ears. We need to give a sense of touch and make the world feel tactile. And these two other ones we haven't explored as much in the past. We've been focused on graphics all of these years, but fortunately they're related to a lot of what we've been doing for years now, and related to graphics in many ways. And what we found is that once we started introducing even the very basic elements of audio and touch and physics to these worlds, it creates a much more immersive experience. I really urge you, if you haven't tried it yet, go try our Funhouse demo in the back, and you'll get a sense of what I'm talking about. We'll show you a demo here later, but it doesn't compare to actually doing it yourself. Yes, so I mentioned that we don't have the power currently to make completely photoreal environments that are extremely complex in virtual reality. We can do some nice stuff right now, but fundamentally, it requires 7 times more horsepower to do the same thing that you would see in a video game today in virtual reality. The reason behind this is these displays that you have to put on your head are fundamentally high resolution. So right there, you need to generate more pixels, and that requires more horsepower. But it's also in stereo, and the worst of it is you need a much higher frame rate. It has to run at least 90 hertz. You go below that, people start getting sick, and that's not good. That's just never a good thing. So performance matters. You need to have raw processing power, and that's what we're striving to do. That's why we spend billions of dollars to develop new architectures like Pascal. That's why Jonah worked so hard, and luckily we're delivering it. So we're getting closer and closer, and we're closing this gap between what a modern video game looks like, that quality, and what we can bring to virtual reality, not just through raw processing power, but through all of the tricks that we're doing, all the new features that we're adding to our architectures to optimize for this new way of looking at things. I won't belabor this. We had Jonah and especially Tom show us plenty of things earlier, but But these are the key technologies that give us a huge boost in performance that let us get closer to this immersion and what we really crave. Simultaneous multi-projection. All right, so graphics we've talked about a lot in the past. Performance, this is the key slide. We specifically called out VR with this performance because it's so important. We think it really is the future, and once people get a chance to experience it, most people I believe are going to stay there, because as somebody said yesterday, reality sucks. And to get there, we need a 1080 right now. All right, audio and VR. Audio is an interesting thing. People care about sound, they care about music, they care about things sounding good. But in general, our awareness or our understanding of sound is not as acute as our visual senses, or so we think. Looking into this more deeply, coming from the graphics world, I've always been kind of skeptical about how important audio is for a gaming experience and how much processing power we should dedicate to it versus more graphics, because it's always a trade-off. Well, it turns out that maybe for a normal game, that's okay, but in virtual reality, it's absolutely critical. Humans have the ability to do what's called echolocation. It's similar to what bats do, but just not as good as what they do. If you walk down the stairs at night to your kitchen to go get a snack, and the lights are off, you can somehow navigate your way through the house just through the sounds of your footsteps. The way sound behaves with your environment actually gives you cues as to what your environment looks like. And people do this regularly. People that are blind develop this ability and become much better at it, much more sensitive. So having this missing in a virtual reality experience is noticeable, and it's one of the things that creates a suspension of disbelief. So we've been working for years here. I don't know if Tony Scudiero is still around, but he's been. We hired him a while ago. He used to work on doing algorithms to find tanks and snipers in cities through the reverb that happens throughout a cityscape. Apparently, this is an extremely difficult problem. So he came over to us and has brought some technology to do some of this sound modeling and bring it into VR. Simulating audio, it requires 3 distinct stages. There's synthesis. This is how you create the original sounds that you're going to play. There's direction, that kind of tells you where it's coming from, gives you a feeling of where all the sound sources are. And propagation. And this is the indirect effects of sound. Even after a sound reaches you directly from a sound source, it continues to travel throughout the environment and interact with the environment. You have reflections, absorption, etc. I'll get into that in a second. For synthesis, there's essentially 3 kinds. You can play sampled sounds. These are sounds that are recorded, and that's probably the most common thing we do. But we also have procedural sounds. This is like what you would do with a music synthesizer, where you tweak parameters and create patches, as they're called. And it's actually very similar to what we do with shaders. You can have texture maps that are scanned or taken from a photograph, or write some mathematics and an algorithm to generate something procedurally. One thing that would be awesome, but nobody's really doing much of yet, is simulating actual sound. Ideally, what we would do for any sound source, say a drum, a snare, is model these things just like we do for graphics, but have it so that when you bang on the drum with the drumstick, the motion of the drum and its interaction with the environment generates sound waves. And so nobody's quite doing that yet, except in very specific things, so we won't talk about it too much more, but it'll be cool if we do. The other stuff we are doing. Most sound systems these days have the ability to simulate direction. Key components of that are time, interaural level, and spectral components. So I'll explain them a little bit more, but essentially they let you figure out where a sound source is based on differences on what you hear from both of your ears. It's similar to how we have depth perception with our eyes by having two of them. The differences let us know where things are positioned. Oh, Tony's right there. So you can correct me if I mess any of this up. And finally, the last stage here, propagation, that's one that we don't really do. We cheat it quite a bit. No, well, we do it, but I mean, in general, it hasn't been done much. It's been cheated through reverb effects and essentially pre-made kinds of filters that kind of fake what's going on in a given room. In a game, maybe they'll have a different kind of reverb effect depending on which part of the scene you're in, but it's not really modeling the interaction of all of the objects in the scene, particularly when the scene is dynamic and things are moving around and changing position in the scene. You all right with that? It was okay? I mentioned interaural time difference and level difference. With time difference, essentially when sound emits from a source, similar to lights emitting from a light source, because sound moves so much slower than light, we can actually detect the time difference between it arriving at one ear versus the other. And our brains are pretty good at figuring out roughly which direction that comes from, given this difference. The other thing that happens is as sound travels, it loses energy. There's, just like how light, as it travels or spreads out, it gets dimmer and dimmer. That difference also tells us direction. And finally, there's the spectral component, and this is a little bit trickier. Because the shapes of our ears and our shoulders, etc., our body essentially acts as a kind of filter when sound reaches us and bounces around in our ear and on our shoulders. You can have reflections or echoes that cancel out parts of the frequency spectrum of sound. So depending on what these differences are, the brain can somehow tell how high the sound source is. So the other two tell us roughly which direction in two axes, but the final one tells us what the elevation of a sound source is. All right. So to solve the propagation problem, Tony has created this awesome system that's built on top of our optics library, our ray tracing library that leverages our GPUs to do lots and lots of ray casts. Sound waves turn out to be not dissimilar to light and how light behaves. So we can reuse a lot of the primitives that we've built up, extremely high performance, to model the same thing. And what we do with this system is we take the sound source, that's what comes from the synthesis part of this, the location and destination of the sound. So location would be equivalent to how we have light sources in graphics. You need to position that somewhere and light emits from it somehow, or sound emits from it in this case. And the equivalent of the camera is the person's ear. So we model the listener somehow within this scene. And then we have the environment, and this is something that's missing with pretty much all sound systems in games today, and this is what's truly novel here. We can incorporate some representation of the actual environment, and not just the environment, but also the characters potentially, or other objects. Maybe there's a large tank or something moving through the scene. We can model that because optics is capable of adjusting its acceleration structures based on dynamic environments. And finally, we have materials that we input into the system. So different kinds of materials reflect and absorb sound differently. Concrete is very different than a carpet in terms of its sound characteristics. So So you need to input that into the system. All of that goes into our VRWorks audio system built on top of optics. And what we get out of it is the effects. I guess I can go back here. Basically, everything in direction and propagation in this slide. We did this to solve propagation, but a nice side benefit is direction kind of falls out of the calculation naturally. All right. Any questions about audio? Yes. That's you. One or two.
So you're not the first GPU vendor that does hardware accelerated audio. And as good as I think this technology is, we all know what UAD audio. And you do some similar things, you do some different things. But the main question is, what do you think makes that this technology will succeed where the others failed miserably?
So the question, if I may repeat it, was that we're not the first GPU vendor to deal with audio, and we do some things similarly, some things differently. Why is this special or novel, and why will this succeed while theirs failed? Well, fundamentally, my understanding is that this supposed other GPU vendor didn't do any of the propagation stuff. It's all positional audio. Which is fine, but that's already a solved problem in general. Maybe you can accelerate it a little bit here or there, but it wasn't enough to make an impact for it to succeed. But propagation is the key thing. And the way I think about it coming from graphics, the propagation component is kind of analogous to in graphics. For years, we only had direct lighting. You have light sources that can cast shadows, and we calculate exactly what that surface would look like if there was only this one light source there. But in the real world, you have propagation of light throughout the scene. You have global illumination, light bouncing around all over the place. And it doesn't really look real or feel correct until you calculate that aspect of it. So propagation in audio is the equivalent of global illumination in graphics. That's the novel thing here. Tony, do you care to comment on that?
No, you're doing great.
All right.
So in a basic, simple sense, what sort of a performance hit would you see when enabling this kind of feature?
Well, it's not cheap. We have, I know it probably wasn't lost on many of you, we have 3 GPUs for those VR stations out there. My understanding is that the audio we're doing for the audio demo uses not the full Pascal, but a good portion of it. Tony, do you care to? Sure. Why don't you come up here?
Simple answer is that we use a second GPU right now only because the kernels are actually long running and will interfere with the graphics pipeline. And obviously, as you guys have heard, there are ways that we are working on to make that not a problem, right? And so it's just that level of attack we're not there yet.
What's the total compute amount?
The total compute amount.
Yeah, how much of the GPU?
It's totally geometry dependent, and not only geometry dependent, it's dependent on your location in the geometry. Much like any kind of ray tracing or beam tracing, any of these algorithms, depending on how much geometry is around you, really affects the compute time, right? And there are certainly ways, and optics gives us these things, these acceleration structures, that help you prevent that from becoming a nonlinear scale.
And of course, Tony's working very hard to optimize all of that so that it'll be very, very fast. There's a question here, what's the worst case scenario? I think from what Tony is saying, it just really depends. It's much like ray tracing, where you can construct degenerate cases that are impossibly hard. But most cases are solvable. All right. You had a question?
Yeah. This VRWorks audio cares about the relative motion factor of the sound, because if you need to reproduce a Doppler
Right.
kind of thing, you need.
So the question is, does VRWorks audio know about the velocity That's actually a fairly simple thing to add if you care to do that in your sound system. You already know the velocity of all of the objects, and basically you just do a pitch shift, right? So if you care to do Doppler, you can, but it turns out from the research that that's been done, or the lack thereof, Doppler effects aren't very useful in figuring out the position of things. So it tends to be not that important.
Question back here.
He has one more question.
Quick question. How many rays can be cast at a time?
So the question is, how many rays can be cast at a time? For the demo we have over here, for the sound source.
For each sound.
For each sound source. I don't think there's any particular limit, right? It's just whatever computation. You get more fidelity as you increase it, much like ray tracing in graphics. But for the demos that we have here, we do 16,000 or so rays.
16K rays for 12 bounces.
Yeah, and 12 bounces, which is key, because if you don't have that many bounces, that's the difference between early reverb or early
They're
echoes.
called early reflections.
Early
Are the
reflections,
first
sorry.
bounces. Those are what really give you the kind of spatial information about the room. So those really give you the extent of the room, and then you get a lot more information about the depth of the space by the what are called the late reverberations, which is kind of what we tend to hear in most reverb systems today, which are the late echoes that are indistinguishable from each other. So here's the way to think about it. Early reflections are when you go to the Grand Canyon and you yell echo, and you hear a coherent with the word echo back. That's an early reflection. It just so happens that that's a very long time for that early reflection. But once you get into what's called the diffuse sound field, where those reflections are all layering on top of each other, you're into what's called late reverb. And you need a lot of rays to model both.
Any other questions? Yes.
SDK-wise, is this designed to hook into any of the current common audio middleware, or how are developers meant to access that?
That's definitely a Tony question.
So VR Funhouse is the method by which it's used in VR Funhouse is a plug-in to Fmod. So Fmod WOIs, yeah, that's where we're going with this.
Which is pretty much every game out there, right? Between those two, you've got it. Any more questions? Before we move on to physics, the other kinds of physics? Because everything is physics. All right. We've talked many times in the past about all the physics simulation that we're doing, where we've been at it for quite a long time, and we keep improving it and adding new types of things we're doing. Turns out physics is really hard, and there's lots of problems to solve. So we'll keep doing it. But when we started exploring virtual reality and the things that are necessary in there, we quickly realized that without physics, the whole thing, the illusion is just broken. Physics is sort of nice to have in a game, but it's a gotta have in virtual reality. You just, if things don't behave correctly, when you're in this environment, you're quickly thrown out of it. You understand that there's something wrong here, and it can actually make you angry.